I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring tonight's program and sponsoring all the programs this month that relate to Shakespeare. We also have another author coming next Tuesday to talk about Shakespeare, and then the following Wednesday we're having our movie night and we'll be showing Anonymous, which is a Hollywood feature film that discusses the Shakespeare authorship question. So that'll be the first Wednesday in May in this room at 5:30. All right, so I just wanted to introduce Mr. Blumenfeld, but before I do so, I did want to talk a little bit about his book, and I wanted to let you know that the book is available to purchase after the talk if you're so interested. So the Marlowe-Shakespeare connection addresses the long-standing debate over the Shakespeare authorship question and offers a daring solution, that the true author of the works attributed to Shakespeare was in fact poet and playwright Christopher Marlowe. The book suggests that Marlowe, supposedly killed in a tavern brawl in 1593, actually faked his own death in order to save himself from an inquisition and certain execution, then continued writing under the pseudonym of William Shakespeare. Citing substantial and compelling evidence, the author outlines several hypotheses to support the case, including the theory that several top people in Queen Elizabeth's government were involved in the plot to save Marlowe, who was reportedly a spy in the Secret Service. And Mr. Blumenfeld actually has a Wikipedia page. You know you've made it in life when you're on Wikipedia, right? So I just pulled a few things from the Wikipedia page. Mr. Blumenfeld has published 10 books on education in America, and he has spent much of his career investigating the following problems: the decline in American literacy, the reasons for the high rate of learning disabilities in American children, the reasons behind the educational establishment and America's support for sex and drug education, the reasons why so many children are labeled ADD, and why the school system refuses to use intensive phonics in reading and instruction and memorization in mathematics instruction. Blumenfeld has also written for the John Birch Society. He was born in New York, educated there, and graduated from the City College of New York in 1950. The book publishing industry is where he spent his next 10 years as editor of the Universal Library at Grosset and Dunlap. His bold commentary on education issues and his veneration as a speaker have brought him to lecture in every state in the country, as well as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and England. He is internationally recognized as a leader in the intensive systematic phonics movement. Recently, he has been very active in the Shakespeare authorship question, theorizing that Christopher Marlowe may have written many of the works attributed to Shakespeare. Mr. Blumenfeld has written for many online and print sources on a variety of subjects. His writings have appeared in such diverse publications as Homeschool Digest, Reason, Education Digest, Boston Magazine, Vital Speeches of the Day, Practical Homeschooling, Esquire, and many others. And finally, he is a World War II veteran of the Italian campaign. Pretty accomplished. So everyone, please help me in welcoming Mr. Blumenfeld to the library. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this evening and to discuss a topic very dear to my heart. For one very simple reason. The world considers William Shakespeare, the works of William Shakespeare, to have been the greatest dramas written in all of human history. So you want to know something about the man who wrote the greatest dramas in history. And that's why there has been so much attention given to the authorship question. Because it seems that the facts that we know about William Shakespeare in no way connect with the works attributed to him. So the question has arisen, and it goes back several hundred years, to if Shakespeare didn't write the works attributed to him, this man William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, who did? Well, there have been many theories. At first they thought it might be Sir Francis Bacon. And that was the idea behind the Reverend the, oh my, the Reverend, I should name it, beginning to sound like, I forgot the laws that he was, the department he was supposed to get rid of. But anyway, he was a clergyman who lived near, who was a friend of Samuel Johnson, the writer of the dictionary, the first English dictionary, and he greatly admired the works of Shakespeare. And he lived not too far from Stratford-upon-Avon, so he wanted to do a biography. And this was long after Shakespeare had died. This was around 1780, something like that. And so he went to Stratford, hoping that he would find materials that some of the heirs or the long-lost relatives would have some books, anything pertaining to William Shakespeare. And he went to all of the houses within a 50-mile radius, trying to get documentary evidence that he could use in this biography. And he came up with zero, nothing. Couldn't find a single book, a single document, a single letter, anything pertaining to Shakespeare. Now we know that the man who wrote the 36 plays in the first folio, which was published in 1623, this compendium of all of the plays, this collection, had to be a very well-read individual. He had to be able to read Italian in the original, Latin in the original, because there were no such editions existed in English. He had to know the Bible inside and out. And Shakespeare didn't even own a copy of the Bible. In those days, if you died and left a will, you generally mentioned that you owned the Bible and that you were going to pass it on to an heir. No such thing. He didn't even own the Bible. So this particular gentleman, this clergyman, decided, well, who could possibly have written the plays? And he thought, well, maybe Sir Francis Bacon did. Maybe Bacon did, because Bacon was a great intellect, very well-read man, and of course a great writer. But of course, Bacon was not a dramatist. Not only that, but Bacon was alive when the 36 plays were published in the first folio. And if he had written the greatest plays in all of literary history, he would have taken credit for them. He had an ego as big as a house, and he was not about to let, some other man's name on his work. So there was no motive there for him to have not taken credit for those plays. Well, then along came a man by the name, let me see. The next person who was interested in this, and the first American to seriously doubt Shakespeare's authorship was Delia Bacon, no relation to Sir Francis. Now, she was a brilliant woman with a very successful career as a lecturer in history. And now, she was born in 1811 in Talmadge, Ohio. And in 1852, she turned her interest to literature. And she read all of Shakespeare, coming to the astonishing conclusion that the plays in the first folio revealed a well-hidden, comprehensive philosophy which could have only been written by several philosophers, and she included Bacon and Sir Walter Raleigh and others. And so she decided to pursue her research in England, and she remained in England for 5 years, corresponding with Emerson, Carlyle, and Hawthorne, and spending her last months in sickness and near poverty in Stratford-upon-Avon, where she had hoped to be able to open Shakespeare's tomb. She wrote in one of her last letters, quote, "The archives of this secret philosophical society are buried somewhere, perhaps in more places than one," unquote. Well, her obsession with the authorship mystery affected her mind, and she was brought back to the United States in 1858. The opening chapter of her projected book had been published in Putnam's Monthly magazine in January 1856, but when the book itself, and the title was The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded, was published in 1857, it was largely ignored. And of course, then you had the Civil War, and who no one was interested in what Delia Bacon had to say. Well then, the next individual who had an idea as to who wrote the plays was an Irish teacher by the name of Thomas J. Loney, spelled Looney, L-O-O-N-E-Y, but it was pronounced Loney. And he wrote a book in 1920 in which he decided that Shakespeare, that the man who wrote the plays attributed to Shakespeare was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And Carlton Ogburn, who became an Oxfordian, wrote, "Loney did what no other had done before. He approached the quest for the author systematically, with a completely open mind. He deduced 17 characteristics of the author and then set out to comb through the annals of the Elizabethan age to see who would come closest to possessing them." And of course, he thought that it was the Earl of Oxford. Well, Diana Price, who wrote a wonderful book on Shakespeare, she examined every single document related to Shakespeare and decided that he was not a writer. There was not a single document which indicated that he was a writer of any kind. A letter, some reference to him, establishing him as a writer. Yeah, there had been a mention of the name in relation to plays, but that's because his name was on some of the published plays. And she said ultimately, the Oxfordian attempt to undermine chronology falls apart because they really offer nothing in its place. You see, Oxford was born in 1550. Shakespeare was born in 1564. And he died and Oxford died in 1604 before many of the plays were written. So it just didn't make sense. And she said, in fact, Oxfordians offer no chronology at all, and the dating of the plays turns out to be an issue in which they prove to be especially, one might say, woefully weak. Well, it wasn't until 1955 when the third contender came to the fore, Christopher Marlowe, in a book written by Calvin Hoffman, The Murderer of the Man Who Was Shakespeare. Now, he wrote that book was published in 1956, and the reason or the way that Hoffman came to believe that Marlowe was the true author is that when he was a young man, a boy, his mother took him to every single Shakespeare play that was being given in New York. And he became a great scholar of the Elizabethan age. He read everything, and he read all of Marlowe and all of Shakespeare. And he began to see in Shakespeare so many echoes from Marlowe's plays that he decided there must be a connection between the two. It can't be just coincidence. But the history books told us that Marlowe was killed in 1593 at the age of 29 and could not have written all those other plays. But Professor Hodson of Harvard University had discovered the actual coroner's inquest into the murder of Marlowe. It was written in Latin, was translated into English, and Hoffman came to the conclusion that it was phony, that it was a cover-up for a murder that never took place, and that Marlowe continued to live after 1593. Now, Hoffman came to my office one day. I was the editor at Grosset and Dunlap of the Universal Library, and we reprinted in quality paperbacks some of the great classics. And he wanted us to reprint his book, The Murder of the Man Who Was Shakespeare. Now, I knew nothing about the authorship question. I was a typical graduate of a liberal college, the City College of New York, and of course, we never discussed that kind of a question. We all assumed that Shakespeare's authorship was very well documented. But according to Hoffman, it wasn't. There were so many empty years that it was ridiculous to even consider that Shakespeare had actually written any of the plays. And then he pointed out to me a coincidence which convinced me that Marlowe was the writer, and this was it. I've put it here to show you the timeline. Both men, Marlowe and Shakespeare, were born in the same year, 1564. From 1564 to 1593, Marlowe had an extraordinary education and career as a writer. He wrote such plays as Dr. Faustus and The Jew of Malta, and great masterpieces. And then he was suddenly, supposedly killed in 1593. Well, then we look at Shakespeare's timeline. What did he do from 1564 to 1593? Nothing. Nothing that we know of. In fact, there are in here what they call the lost years. They don't even know where he was. But suddenly in 1593, several months after the death, the so-called death of Marlowe, this man Shakespeare emerges as a great writer with Venus and Adonis, one of the greatest poems in the English language. In 1590, and then goes on to write these fabulous plays until 1616 when he dies. Meanwhile, in 1623, the first folio is published containing the 36 greatest plays in all of English and literary history. So that convinced me. Marlowe supposedly died at the age of 29. Shakespeare begins his career at age 29, which is unheard of in the Elizabethan era in those days. And that's what did it for me. And so I began to do my own research on that. Hoffman died, I think it was in 1983, and in the 1980s, I decided to follow up on his book and do one of my own to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Marlowe was indeed the author of the works attributed to Shakespeare. But you see, in order to convince yourself that this is a fact, you first have to read Marlowe. And how many people read Marlowe first? You can't understand the plays of Shakespeare until you first read the plays of Marlowe, because the connection is so, is so great. And it's overwhelming. So you first have to read the plays of Marlowe. And in order to write this book, I read all of the plays of Marlowe, everything he wrote, and I was able to piece together this history. What had happened was, first of all, on the whole issue of education, there is no documentation at all of Shakespeare having gotten any education at all. Yes, there was a grammar school in his town, which he could have attended, but there's no documentation that he actually attended it. In fact, you had to be able to read and write in order to attend the grammar school. And from Shakespeare's signatures, it doesn't look like he was able to write very well. He was certainly not, if he couldn't sign his name very well, he certainly could not have written 36 pages by hand. They didn't have typewriters in those days. They didn't have word processors in those days. And it was a laborious thing to write in pen and ink, you know. But in any case, Marlowe had this wonderful education. He had the best education an Englishman could have in the Elizabethan era. He went to the King's School in Canterbury, where he was born, and, you know, got the founding in Latin and Greek and all of that. And then, and he got it on scholarship, because his father was a cobbler. He was a poor man, a cobbler. He was a common man. And then Marlowe got a scholarship to Cambridge University. And who was the Chancellor of Cambridge University but Lord Burleigh, who was Queen Elizabeth's secretary, treasurer, and later became her Secretary of State, her right-hand man. And while at Cambridge, Marlowe was recruited into the Secret Service, because at that time there was a great struggle going on between the Catholics and the Protestants. And even the Pope excommunicated Queen Elizabeth and said that Catholics should assassinate her. So, of course, the Protestant leaders of Elizabeth's time were very concerned about plots against the Queen. And there was a school in France, Reims, where English Catholic students would go to Reims in France to be indoctrinated in anti-Elizabethan, anti-Reformation work. And Marlowe went as a spy, was sent as a spy by Burleigh and by Sir Francis Walsingham, who was the head of Elizabeth's Secret Service at the time. He was sent to Reims, where he ingratiated himself and pretended that he wanted to convert to Catholicism. He was born in a Protestant family. And so he was very well known to Burleigh and Walsingham and even the Queen. And when he came back from Reims, when he came back from his mission and wanted to get his master's degree at Cambridge University, the authorities would not give it to him because they thought that he had gone over to the other side. So Lord Burleigh wrote a letter from the Privy Council to the authorities at Cambridge, and they said, this man, Christopher Marlowe, has served the Queen well in his work, and he should get his master's degree. There you have it. He was able to get the top man in the government to write a letter to the authorities in Cambridge that got his degree, that made it possible for him to get his degree. And then, of course, right after that, he went to London and became a great hit with his plays, and became quite popular. But he also, because he was a great geniuses do some stupid things sometimes. And he was a little outspoken about certain things. And he was accused of being blasphemous and saying all kinds of things, of being atheistic and all of that. And he was threatened with possible execution. And he was called into the commission that had been set up to root out atheists and Catholics and all of that. And he had a report to them. And during that time, his friends arranged to have a fake death take place so that he would then be free of any such indictment hanging over his head. And this was done at a house in Deptford, the Seaport. The house in Deptford, where several men, also part of Thomas Walsingham's group. Thomas Walsingham was Marlowe's patron. And they arranged for this phony death, and Marlowe was then spirited out of the country, went into exile, where he continued to write plays. And all of this was covered up by this coroner's inquest. They had a body, but it wasn't Marlowe's. It was somebody else, and I believe we know who it was. And Marlowe then went on writing the plays. Now, he sent the plays back. We believe he went to Italy. And he sent whatever he wrote back, about 2 plays a year, to Walsingham, at first to Burley, through a diplomatic courier, because Marlowe was a member of the Secret Service and was also performing his duties as an intelligence agent. And so the manuscripts were sent to Burley, who then gave them over handed them to Thomas Walsingham, who then had a scribe copy Marlowe's original text. And then Marlowe's publisher, Ed Blount, his publisher Ed Blount, took the neatly written manuscripts to this man named William Shakespeare, who was an actor and part owner of the Globe Theatre. And nobody asked any questions. The reason why Shakespeare was chosen as the front was because he was very discreet. He kept his mouth shut and went along with it, and was very well paid for being this front. And so Shakespeare's name appears on only 19 of the plays that have been published in quarto form, single plays published. And it appears that Marlowe probably stopped writing the plays in 1612, and that's when Shakespeare retired. There were no more plays coming in. There was no reason for him to stay at the Globe Theatre, and he retired to Stratford-upon-Avon, where he conducted his usual business, because he was a businessman. He was a very successful businessman for an individual in that period, and he had made a lot of money. Probably because he was an excellent front. And he died in 1616, and when Shakespeare died, nobody mentioned anything about it. They didn't consider it he wasn't known as a great playwright. People knew to some degree that somebody else wrote the plays. They weren't sure who. But they knew that in those days, many plays were written anonymously. There were no names on these plays. Why? Because you could be sent to jail if what you had in your play didn't please the government. And then authors worked together. But apparently, the reason why Shakespeare's plays are so outstanding and have come down to us in a way that the writers of other plays haven't is because they were written by one man, not a committee. You see, back in Elizabethan times, the theater people would pay a group of writers to write a play, as they do in Hollywood. You know, in Hollywood, screenplays are written by committees. They're not written by a single great author, although sometimes a great author is hired to work on a script. But that was also the case. And it was Henslowe, whose theater was producing Marlowe's plays and also Shakespeare, supposedly Shakespeare. But Shakespeare's name is never mentioned in Henslowe's diary. Now, if Shakespeare was one of the great playwrights at the time, how come he's not mentioned anywhere? Henslowe's diary doesn't mention him at all. Although the plays are mentioned. But there's no indication that, because Henslowe had a diary in which he said how much he paid each one of these people. And there's no indication that Shakespeare was actually working on any play. So that's another indication that he didn't write these plays. And but Marlowe continued to write these plays until, I believe, 1612, when he decided he had had enough. That it was not easy writing these plays, as you can imagine, a play like Hamlet. But now, I read all of the plays, in the 36 plays, and I was able to find all sorts of clues, Marlowe clues, in Shakespeare's plays. Hamlet is full of them. You wouldn't believe it, would you? You would think of the great play, Hamlet would not have any of these clues, but there are many very important clues in that play. For example, one of Marlowe's first play was Dido, Queen of Carthage. And in that play, Aeneas has fled from Troy, where this great destruction had taken place by the Greeks, and his ship, founded on the shores of Carthage, was shipwrecked. And Aeneas came on shore. He met the queen. Queen Dido fell in love with him. She fell in love with Aeneas. And she asked Aeneas to tell her what had happened in Troy. And Aeneas gives this long narration of the horrors that took place in Troy. Now in Hamlet, when Hamlet orders these players to come to Elsinore to put on the play that's going to, provoke the guilt of Claudius the king, he asks the players if they could give him a sample of their acting. And he says, there's this play, this wonderful play about Aeneas and Troy, and could you recite that particular portion of the play? He says, it's a great play, this wonderful play, it was caviar for the general. And so the player practically recites verbatim the lines from Marlowe's play. It's not an exact replay, but it's close enough so that he had to know that play. Now, why would Shakespeare take something out of Dido, Marlowe's first play, and put it in his play. That's the sort of thing you find throughout the Shakespeare plays, all of these clues that are taken directly from Marlowe. I mean, what's this great obsession he has with Marlowe, you know? And I found all sorts of clues. I could not believe how the easy ones, I found the easy ones, the ones that sort of leapt out of the pages. But there must be many others to which I was not aware of, simply because there are many subtleties in the plays which you have to know more about, just as there are in the sonnets, you know, these subtleties that may be hiding something. But in any case, I found enough to convince me that Marlowe was indeed the writer of these plays. Now, another interesting thing. When Marlowe was just starting out as a young man, he used to go to the bookstalls around St. Paul's Cathedral, and one of the publishers there that he met was Ed Blount, who was about his age. And they became very good friends. And Ed Blount, oh, thank you. Very good. Ed Blount became a very good friend of his. And he also got to know Marlowe's benefactor, Walsingham, Sir Thomas Walsingham. And in 1598, he published Hero and Leander, Marlowe's poem, Marlowe's great poem. And he published it posthumously. And in his dedication, he said that he was Marlowe's executor. Marlowe's executor. So there you have Ed Blount at the beginning of Marlowe's career as a dramatist, becoming his friend. Then, several years after his supposed death, becomes his executor. And then in 1623, Ed Blount decides to collect all of the plays for the first folio. He becomes the publisher of the first folio. In other words, Ed Blount was the one person who knew this whole conspiracy from beginning to end. Because some of the plays in the first folio were revised for publication, which means that Marlowe was alive in 1523 so that he could make the revisions in the plays. That's how we know that he had to have been alive, you see, in 1623. Also, we know that as a publisher, Ed Blount also published the first English translation of Don Quixote. And do you know who did that translation? Marlowe. How do we know it was Marlowe? The man who was supposed to have written that translation was a man by the name of Thomas Shelton. If you look him up, there is a Thomas Shelton, but he didn't write that translation. The Thomas Shelton who wrote that translation sort of disappears. You don't know where he went to, where he came from, where he went to. But the interesting thing about the name Thomas Shelton is that Thomas comes from Sir Thomas Walsingham. And Shelton was the maiden name of his wife, Audrey Shelton. Now that's an extraordinary coincidence. Thomas Shelton, you see. So Ed Blount is the key individual in this whole conspiracy from beginning to end. And he is there at the end, being the publisher of the first folio. Now, if you read general biographies of William Shakespeare, Ed Blount is barely mentioned. You know, they just say, the first folio was published by Shakespeare's friends, you know, in the theater. But I consider Ed Blount to be the most important character in this whole story. Another important point about the authorship question is that the plays, as we know, are magnificent dramas that have lasted for centuries. And also the fact that the writer of those plays was a prolific inventor of new words. He invented over 1,000 new words that had never been used before anywhere else. So this was a highly educated man. And also, Marlowe had gone to Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, which was a staunch Calvinist college, and was very well versed in the Bible. And throughout Shakespeare, there are constant references to things in the Bible. Shakespeare didn't own a Bible, but Marlowe must have read a half dozen different versions of the Bible while he was at Cambridge University and also at the King's School. So there's no question in my mind who the writer of the play is. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with Wayne Dyer. He's been on public television. He's a great speaker. He wrote a book entitled The Power of Intention. And he said, when you change the way you look at things, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. You see. That's why it's so easy for me when I talk about Hamlet, I say, oh, you mean Marlowe's great play? Hamlet, you see. Or Midsummer Night's Dream. Or you mean Marlowe's great comedy? See, because the way I see this whole business is I see it as Marlowe's works. Because he was the only one who had the genius, and believe you me, these works had to be written by a supreme literary genius. This was the only way that they could be written. They had to be written by a great genius, and Marlowe was that individual. And so, for me, the authorship question is one of simply trying to convince others who the true author is, because if you're dealing with the greatest works in all of literature, you want to know who wrote them, and you want to know something about the man who wrote them. And there are also, and of course, the kind of clues that, for example, there is a portrait of Marlowe. Here's the portrait. This was used on the cover of a book about Marlowe, holding up the mask, the Shakespeare picture that's on the cover of the first folio. It looks like a mask. But the inscription on that portrait of Marlowe is, quod me nutriet, me destruit. In other words, that which nourishes me destroys me. Very peculiar, very kind of cynical one, but this was a portrait painted while he was at Cambridge University. Now you'll find that same motto in Measure for Measure, in Pericles, and also in some of the sonnets. It's one of the interesting little tidbits that you keep finding out. The more you read, as a matter of fact, that's the beauty of this whole question, is that it's unfathomable. I mean, it's so deep, there's so much to it, that people try to find even things in it that aren't even there. But there's more than enough there to satisfy anybody. For example, biographers of Shakespeare, I would say any standard biography of William Shakespeare today is 85% fiction. Because we know whatever there is to know about Shakespeare now, there isn't very much. For example, here I gave you I think I delivered that sheet. If I hadn't, let me do that now. Can you pass this out? Oh, you do have that? No. Pass this out. See now, on the left-hand side, you've got Marlowe. You've got him, by the age of 24, he had gotten his master's degree, and he wrote a translation of the Roman poet Ovid, Dido, Queen of Carthage, Tamburlaine 1 and 2. In 1590, he wrote Dr. Faustus, The Jew of Malta, Massacre at Paris, and Edward II. And etc. Now you go over to Shakespeare and you find that this is all we know, basically we know about Shakespeare that can be documented. No documented education. Married Anne Hathaway at age 18, had a daughter a year later. As a matter of fact, that's why he had to marry her, was because he had impregnated Anne Hathaway. He had twins, Hamlet and Judith, born in 1585. Then 1586 to 93, 6 years, 7 years. The lost years. There's nothing. They can find nothing about it. But then in 1593, he suddenly emerges as a great genius, having written Venus and Adonis. From 1593 to 1612, he writes 36 plays, later published in the First Folio. And in 1612 retires to Stratford, dies, etc. And all we know about him really is what Diana Price told us in her 2001 book, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography. She wrote, now she examined every single document that has been dug up. And you can believe that it has been an army of scholars who have gone through every possible archive to find documents about Shakespeare. And she writes, she says, these documents account for his activities as an actor, a theater shareholder, a businessman, a moneylender, a property holder, a litigant, and a man with a family, but they do not account for his presumed life as a professional writer, unquote. And of course, you know, Mark Twain was a skeptic on the authorship issue, and he wrote about his well-known will, the last will and testament. He says, it named in minute detail every item of property he owned in the world, houses, lands, swords, silver gilt bowl, and so on, all the way down to his second best bed and its furniture. It mentioned not a single book. Books were much more precious than swords and silver gilt bowls, than swords and silver gilt bowls. And when a departing person owned one, he gave it a high place in his will. The will mentioned not a play, not a poem, not an unfinished literary work, not a scrap of manuscript of any kind. And the thing about the first folio, published in 1623, is that Ed Blount, Marlowe's publisher, knew where to find all of the plays. Some of them belonged to the theater company. Others had never been published before. How did he find them? Where did he go to find them? Apparently he had access to all of them, which is extraordinary, which is why that particular book is so extraordinary. So the point I want to make is that we know who wrote the plays. At least I do. I'm convinced. But trying to convince the world of this is tough because you have a whole industry that has grown around the idea that William Shakespeare wrote the plays. If you go to Stratford upon Avon, it's like Disney World, you know. Everything revolves around the idea that William Shakespeare wrote the plays. And of course, when you challenge that, you have this huge establishment that rallies around and refuses to even acknowledge that you exist. So that's why we have a tough time, and I'm sure that we have the same thing, you know, occurring all throughout civilization, where you have establishments that prevent any kind of dissent because they have a vested interest, an economic vested interest in maintaining that orthodox view of things. So that's why it's difficult to get this word out. Now, I included in the papers that I gave to you a review I did of Anonymous, the recent movie by Emmerich on the Oxford theory. And I wondered why this man, this brilliant cinema producer, would have chosen such an absolute ridiculous thesis, authorship theory. But who knows how these things happen? I had hoped that somebody would take my book and make a movie out of it. That would at least pay for what it cost me to produce it. But you have to accept things as they are. But in any case, I wrote my book because I wanted a statement to be made that would be convincing enough. Now, we already have a blog, an excellent blog by Marlovians. All you have to do is type in your search engine, Google, the Marlowe Shakespeare Connection, and click, search, and it'll come up, and you will find a wonderful blog written by superb Marlovians, very well versed, who have done an awful lot of work. You see, the whole point is if we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Marlowe lived after 1593, of course, everybody would have to acknowledge that. And, of course, we know that he lived beyond 1593, and we have indications of it. But it's the kind of thing that's not 100% certain. The kind of documentation which would give us an open and shut case just is not there. But you must remember that the people who have tried to document Shakespeare's life represent an army of thousands of scholars, with lots of money from foundations and universities and all of that, who have spent time and effort to document Shakespeare's life, but only maybe 1% of that has been spent on trying to find out what Marlowe was doing after his so-called death. So in other words, if we had the same resources that have been used to track Shakespeare, and what have they come up with? Nothing. That's the whole point of it, is that with all the money and research that has been gone into trying to find facts about Shakespeare as a writer, they've come up with nothing. But if they would just put some of that effort into finding finding more facts about Marlowe's life, I'm sure we'd be able to come up with some wonderful things. There have been hints of that there may be something in archives in Italy and elsewhere that we might be able to look into. In any case, I hope that I have given you some thoughts. I hope that I've been able to at least, stimulate some interest in finding out for yourself and reading for yourselves. My book, The Marlowe Shakespeare Connection, is a great read, by the way. And I have 2 copies that I have available for sale. Believe it or not, they're $45 a piece. That's life in these days. That's publishers' bane. That's the price of books these days. But it's worth it. And I'll be glad to sign a copy, if you like, which will make it infinitely more valuable. So if you ever want to sell it on eBay, you might be able to make a profit. But in any case, I'll open the floor now to your questions and discussions and whatever your thoughts might be. I'll be very glad to entertain them. Thank you. Any questions or any points?
The thing is, if you take a look, I haven't read all the plays, of course, but the thing is, really, if you take a look at Marlowe's plays between 1564 and 1593 and the works of Shakespeare, the writing style is very similar.
Right.
Too.
Yes. Well, that's how Calvin Hoffman got to this, came to that conclusion. He had read all of Marlowe and all of Shakespeare, and he said he found so much of Marlowe and Shakespeare. He said there's something going on here. And when he found out, when he was able to get hold of the coroner's inquest on the so-called murder of Marlowe, he decided, that's phony. The whole thing is phony. Just read it. And I quote it in my book. You can read it in my book and see what the actual inquest said. And it's a scenario right out of Hollywood, you know. So, but the point I make, and I devote a great deal of the book to first quoting Marlowe, so that the reader will know you're dealing with a supreme literary genius in Marlowe before you even get to the plays attributed to Shakespeare. So that's why, see, Hoffman couldn't do that in his book. He didn't do that to the extent that I do. And also, we know a little more today than Hoffman knew back in 1956, you know, when he wrote his book. So I put all of that in my book. And of course, also, as I said, I went through every single play and every single of the 36 plays and was able to find these clues leaping out of the pages, you know, without much sleuthing, you know, as a detective, you know. But do you have any, you mentioned something about the Earl of Rutland. Somebody has suggested that it might be the Earl of Rutland.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the only, you know, there are even theories that the plays were written by a woman, a Jewish woman, believe it or not. But it's so patently ridiculous. Not, you know, you just can't choose, you know, pick a name out of somebody and say, oh, well, I think that it was the Earl of Rutland or some other individual writing. First of all, to write 36 of the greatest plays in history requires genius. Not everybody has that. And it requires stick-to-itiveness. You know, to write those 36 plays required a tremendous effort, writing effort. Can you imagine? It was all done by hand, too, in those days. And on parchment. Okay.
I've got a question. Wasn't there something about this Richard Green and this word called shake scene?
Yes,
Could
yeah,
you-
let me go into that. One of the proofs that they use that Shakespeare wrote these plays is that a fellow by the name of Robert Greene, who was a friend of Marlowe's, who also went to Cambridge, and was also being played by Henslow's company, he had developed quite an antagonism toward the main actor in that company. And so he wrote a kind of autobiographical study of his own life a year before, in 1592, in which he referred to this actor as a shake scene, shake-scene, somebody who shakes the scene, shakes the stage, you see. So a fellow by the name of Thomas Tyrwhitt, in 1766, long after it was written, came across that particular writing by Greene, and when he saw the word shake scene, he assumed that it referred to Shakespeare. But it didn't refer to Shakespeare, it referred to that actor who was acting those parts in Greene's plays and in Marlowe's plays, who was the shake scene. Now, it's interesting that when Greene, I'm trying to think, the biographer, recent biographer of Shakespeare, something with the wind. Do you know what that, will of the wind, will of the wind, or will in the wind, let me see. In any case, he's a very well-known professor of Shakespeare's works, has a great reputation, and he wrote a biography of Shakespeare, which has got a great deal of publicity, and he refers to Shake scene. But you know what he does? He removed the hyphen between shake and scene. Why did he do that? Why would he do something which is so unscholarly? And that's because he wanted to, he was cheating. You don't do that. The name is hyphenated in the original word, which is called groat's worth of wit, written by Robert Greene in 1592. He cheated. But that's the kind of thing that these Stratfordians do. They cheat. They cheat.
Was that book Will in the World?
Oh, what, it's,
Will in the World?
yeah, Will in the Wind, is that it?
No, Will in the World. Stephen Greenblatt?
Yes.
Is that him?
Greenblatt is the author. You have to excuse me, I'm 86 years old, so my memory isn't all it used to be. But the interesting thing is I started writing this book in my 70s, so there's hope for everyone. There is life after 65. And the thing is to embark on some great project. It took me 7 years to write this book. And, but it was worth it. It was a wonderful experience reading all of these plays and putting together this whole conspiracy, you know, and I should have gotten a PhD just for writing the book, but of course, I had a tough time getting it published, by the way. But I did get it published by Macfarlane. They published scholarly books. And so I was, at first, you know, when I started the project, I didn't realize it would take 7 years. I didn't realize what I would have to go through to complete the book. But I did it because I said, hey, this is going to be a great seller. You know, it's like, what's that, the code book, what's his name? The Da Vinci Code. I thought, well, this is better than the Da Vinci Code. He made $1 million on that. I should at least make $1 million on this. But believe it or not, I've made about $500 on royalties. That's about it. Because this is not a story that the academy, the academia, want to circulate, you know. That's why they don't care if a ridiculous movie is made like Anonymous, because nobody's going to believe it. It's so appallingly ridiculous that who cares, you know, that serves their purpose. When someone comes up with such an idiotic alternative to the Stratfordian position. But because our position, the Marlowian position, is so reasonable and so well based on fact that naturally they're going to prevent it from being widely read. But, you know, yes.
If you suppose that Marlowe died in 1616 and that Blount presented the first folio.
Shakespeare died in 1660.
Oh, Shakespeare did. We don't know when Blount died.
We don't know when Blount, well, we know when Blount died, but we don't know when Marlowe died.
Marlowe, that's right. That's what I mean.
But the point is that I believe that Marlowe had to be alive in 1623 in order to be able to help Blount prepare the manuscripts for the first folio. Because many of the lines in the plays in the first folio did not appear elsewhere. They had to be inserted by the author, you see. That's one of the clues that we have that Marlowe was alive at the time, is that everybody says, well, they had to be written by the author. Shakespeare was dead, so he couldn't do it. And the only one who could was the actual author, who added lines, in some places substantial lines, you see. Another interesting thing, Marlowe's father was a cobbler. And I'm sure that many of you have seen the play Henry V. The great scene where they have this victory, and he claims, we had this victory on St. Crispin's Day. Remember to Laurence Olivier or talking about St. Crispin's Day. Well, who do you think St. Crispin was? He was the saint of the cobblers. Marlowe's father was a cobbler, and St. Crispin. Now, why would Henry V refer to St. Crispin's Day? That's, Marlowe was very clever in the way he inserted himself into these plays. Did it in ways that you could barely recognize.
Did you go to England a while back to and present this to them?
Did I go to England?
Did you go to England a couple of years
No,
ago?
but the interesting thing, I thought I would have to go to England to write this book. But so much has been written. And of course, all the books that were written in England are available in the United States in one way or another. You can find them. And I found more than enough material to be able to write this book without going there. I would only go to England to try to do some original research, which has not been in any books. It's amazing how much scholarship has been put into the plays themselves, into their origins, when they were first produced, where were they derived from, and of course, when they tell you that the play is derived from an Italian book that had not been translated into English, well, what do the Shakespeareans do about it? They just say, oh, well, he must have known Italian, you see. No indication he knew Italian, that he ever even... And then you find people saying that only someone who had been to Italy could have possibly written those Italianate plays, because the details could have only been known to somebody who was actually there, for example, in Venice, on the Rialto Bridge and that sort of thing. But Shakespeare, the man Shakespeare, never left England. We have no indication that he traveled anywhere, but we do know that Marlowe did. Marlowe was very cosmopolitan and very well educated, and he knew history, and he knew religion, and he knew what was going on in the world, and that's why he was also an excellent spy. And it was because he was a spy that brought him in contact with the top people in Elizabeth's government. As a matter of fact, the reason why they were able to concoct this phony death was because of the help they had from Lord Burleigh, who must have told Queen Elizabeth, saying, hey, we've got to save our friend Marlowe from the Inquisition, because look at the good work he's done, and besides, he's a very valuable asset. And Queen Elizabeth must have told Burleigh, well, you do whatever you have to do. It may be illegal, but it will never get beyond my lips what you do. And so when the coroner's inquest came in, it went to Elizabeth, she signed off on everything, and the plot was hatched without any problems. Well, we have only 15 minutes before this library closes down at 8 o'clock. So I will end here, but if you have any more questions, or if you'd like to get a book, that'll be very good. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it entertaining and interesting, and it will stimulate you to look into this even more deeply. Thank you.